Hello, everyone. Today I am here with Robin Paquette, our CAO, and myself, junior planner with the town of Arnprior, and we are going to talk to you today a bit about secondary residential dwellings and garden suites. So, Robin, why don't you start by introducing yourself and maybe explain a little bit about what is the best way for people to understand your job?
Sure. Thanks, Payton. As CAO, I've been in this position since the beginning of 2020. Before that, I was the town planner for 20 years, and a few years before that in the former township of West Carleton. So while I'm CAO now, I have a lot of planning experience for sure. And to understand my job now, I've heard it recently described sort of like an hourglass. If you think about the sands of time above and the space below. And I'm sort of that pinch point in the middle. And if you think about the top being council and their direction that they're giving staff, it all flows through my position as the chief administrative officer to the staff who implement those decisions down below. And then, you can flip it back over and say that staff's implementation then goes through me, and I would report back to council on how we're doing. So bit of I take direction from council, and I ensure that staff have the resources to implement that direction for the town.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna start. We've been hearing a lot about tiny homes around the town, and just wondering what they are and if they might be permitted in the town.
Yeah, we have been hearing a lot about them, absolutely. And we don't actually use the term tiny homes anywhere in any of our planning documents. The tiny home has a very specific connotation in the province, but really in our zoning bylaw, we kind of classify secondary dwelling units in two ways, either as a secondary dwelling unit on a property or as a garden suite. You might also consider a single family home that's really small. If it's, for example, just over the 75 square meters, that's the minimum requirement, and it's the main use on a property, then that really would be a tiny home by definition. It's important to note that secondary dwelling units and garden homes are only permitted in our zoning bylaw if they're secondary to an existing residential dwelling. But single family homes can be quite small if they're built on a single family home lot. And also one thing that we get questioned on a little bit, I think you'll hear too, is that campers and recreational vehicles and cottage and other structures that may be used just on a seasonal basis, could they be considered tiny homes? They aren't in our definition, so they're really a totally separate beast than a tiny home or a secondary unit.
Great, yeah. How would you say that the town defines exactly what is a secondary residential unit versus what is a garden home or garden suite?
Good question. A secondary dwelling unit or secondary residential unit can be one of two things. It can be either a secondary unit within your existing home, or it can be in an accessory building on your property, so a secondary building that's actually put on the property. But it's defined as a separate dwelling unit that contains its own bathroom and kitchen, and that's sort of subordinate or accessory to the existing residential structure. We have rules around the maximum floor area for secondary residential use, specifically that it can't be more than 40% of the gross floor area of the main building containing the principal use on the property, and that the gross floor area doesn't include private garage and basement. So it really keeps it in that sort of category of secondary or accessory because of the size limitation compared to the existing structure. And if you're considering a secondary residential unit within a main dwelling or even as an accessory structure on the property, there are minimum zoning requirements on your property that need to be met. You're only permitted to have one secondary dwelling unit, for example, and accessory structures that are used for secondary units have to meet all the provisions of the zoning bylaw for the zone that they're in. Secondary units are permitted in all of our residential zones, the R1, R2, R3, and R4, which are the different categories that we use for strictly residential use. And it's important to note that there are specific restrictions or requirements, like I said, in each of those zones, but also in particular, one that kind of hangs people up is that there has to be one additional parking space on your property specifically for that secondary unit. And those are things that you need to consider when you're planning having a secondary unit for sure. The difference between a secondary residential unit and a garden suite is interesting. So garden suites, it's really an official term used by the province. The province introduced garden suites many years ago as an option to provide a second separate dwelling unit on your property, specifically for the use of an aging parent of the resident of the main house. And the idea was that it would provide a chance for elderly parents to live close to their family and to receive care from their family, but still live really independently. The province regulations around garden suites required that they be portable, so a portable unit that could be removed at the end of its useful lifetime. And they also put a timeline on the use of those. So the Provincial Planning Act states that garden suites can be on a property for a period of up to 20 years with the possibility of 3 years extensions. So recognizing that there's a time frame as to when someone might require that specific use. The town would require somebody to enter an agreement with the town to ensure that the unit's removed at the end of the required time frame, which wouldn't occur with a secondary residential dwelling unit. There's no time frame around that. So the garden suite is defined by the province as a one-unit detached residential structure that contains the kitchen, bathroom facility that is completely ancillary to the existing residential structure, the main house, and entirely intended to be portable and not permanent. And they are subject to provisions that we have in our zoning bylaw around detached accessory buildings. So the setbacks, for example, for a shed would be the same as for a garden suite. In the town of Arnprior, I can tell you, in my 20 plus years here now, we've never had a garden suite installed. We've never entered into an agreement for one. In my previous employment at West Carleton Township, so a more rural township, we did have a couple of cases where on a really rural property, the owners put a secondary unit, or not a secondary unit, a garden suite for an elderly parent or other family member who really was in need of being close. So, there's a real clear difference under the Planning Act of what's a garden suite, very, very focused on a portable unit for somebody who needs to live with their family for that specific purpose. And then a secondary residential unit, which is sort of a newer concept from the province that allows a second unit within any house or in an accessory building on virtually any residential property, providing it meets the criteria and rules around having that unit there.
Right. What would you say the common reasons property owners decide to build a secondary residential unit versus a garden home suite?
Yeah, like I said, the garden home suites are really very specifically intended for temporary housing for family members, especially seniors with adult children who could provide care. And there has to be a demonstrated need for that unit, as well as an agreement entered into with council to deal with the time frame. But secondary units may be used to provide additional income for any homeowner and to create to create a secondary suite for a caretaker. So just the fact that a secondary residential suite is not intended to be portable or temporary, it really could be used by virtually anyone.
Right. So what are the steps property owners should know about if they decide to build a garden home? What experts are essential to the successful build of this type?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the first step always is to consult with the town. So compliance with the zoning bylaw and planning policies, like I suggested, we need to establish that there's definitely a need for a garden suite and that kind of thing. So, talking to the town first and foremost is imperative. Garden suites are on a case-by-case basis for approval. Secondary dwelling units, not so much. They, like I said, they're permitted in any residential zone. So, you require site plan and building permits for both types of development to ensure compatibility with the lot and the requirements of the bylaw, and that the structures are habitable under the building code. Hiring a qualified designer with a valid BCIN, is recommended to undertake the design of your garden suite or your secondary unit. And like I said at the beginning, we always suggest setting up pre-consultations with staff just to start the conversation and make sure you're on the right track.
Right. What would you say specifically are the town's responsibilities related to the building of any type of secondary housing in Arnprior? Yeah,
certainly, building permits are going to be needed. You're going to need a building permit, a plumbing permit, frequently a site plan that specific, particularly I should say if it's an accessory building, but also to ensure that parking and drainage issues can be addressed. and obviously your building plans that are required with any building permit application. I think those are the key things you need to keep in mind.
Does the town currently provide any funding to assist homeowners in building any type of secondary housing?
At this time, no, the town doesn't have any programs in place, but it is something that we're looking at, and I think council may be tasking staff to look at as we move further along. But at this point, there's no funding in place.
Okay. What do you wish residents would first consider when they decide to build a secondary residential unit or garden home?
Some key things to think about before you're deciding to build. Certainly, ensuring the zoning of your property is correct. Will it allow for an accessory structure or unit? We talked about the zoning being residential. That's a key. What are the planning approvals required that might be required to permit it? Site plan, any other rezonings or anything specific to your property. If your property has adequate servicing to take on an additional unit, or do you need to extend current services to an accessory building, for example? And then, really consider things like the budget that you have, because you're going to need to hire a designer or an architect. Construction costs can often be surprising to people. Planning or building application fees need to be accounted for. So there's a lot to be considered just even in what you're planning as far as the costs involved in a project like that. And, I think it's also important to note that even if the use is permitted on your property and there's no public consultation needed or any public process, it is a good idea to talk to your neighbors, especially for a detached accessory unit on your property that may impact someone's backyard or screen some views or that kind of thing. It's always a good idea to talk to your neighbor and make sure that they understand what you're working at. It often alleviates some of the fear and concerns that can be raised later in the process.
Right. What would you say is the most common issue that homeowners face either during the planning or construction phases?
Well, the biggest problem I think people will find is making sure that they have the additional parking requirements, because it's often a factor, especially in some of our smaller lots, to ensure that the current unit has its required typically 2 parking spaces, and then that there's room for an additional one. And then, trying to find a qualified designer or architect can sometimes take some time and be an issue. We've found in the past for sure. And just making sure that you're meeting the building codes in terms of fire protection and those kind of issues that aren't, in a new build, fairly easy to overcome, but in an existing situation, maybe a little more challenging.
Right. In your view, what is the most commonly overlooked consideration when in the planning or construction phases?
Sure. Well, certainly, like I mentioned, the parking spot issue is one of the biggest issues that we find, and people don't think about it when they're thinking about adding a unit to their property. From a building perspective, things like shared heating systems and proper insulation can sometimes be overlooked. Again, when you're dealing with an existing older structure, that can sometimes be a surprise. And then the other thing to consider is if you're extending existing services from either an existing dwelling or creating new service lines. That can often be expensive, and it's a cost that the homeowners sometimes forget to consider when they're planning the cost of that. So just a few things. And again, pre-consultation can help address some of those concerns and try to answer those questions before people get too far down the road in their planning.
Right. And lastly, what would you say overall, what is the best piece of advice to give to homeowners or anyone looking to do this sort of thing on their property?
Yeah, again, I just consult. Feel free to pick up the phone and call either the chief building official or yourself or myself for advice on what the planning rules and regulations are. Set up an appointment. We're happy to talk it out and see what can be done and give advice as best we can. Sometimes it's just go find a good designer to help you out, and that's just something that people need to consider as well, because we can't always provide all the answers, but we can certainly try and guide people in the right direction to find the answers. And lastly, be patient. This process sometimes takes a bit of time, and people don't factor into the timing when they're thinking about a plan like this, about how long it can take, if there's approvals required, or even the time it takes to find the assistance that they need through a designer and that kind of thing can really add to your project. So be patient, take your time, and do your planning in advance, I think is key.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for all your answers.
Thanks. It was fun.
So I'm here to speak a little bit about infill housing. And the idea sort of came about when we bought our property here in Arnprior last June and realized that the property was larger than we thought. We've actually bought it online. Because of COVID, we couldn't come here and look at things. And we discovered we had a fairly large lot. And as our family came to know the property, we started talking about the possibility of building a secondary house that we could share between our siblings. My wife and I are in our 60s and our siblings are older. So with COVID, what's happened in the last couple of years, we've had the idea of looking out for each other in a different way than has traditionally happened with care homes and that kind of thing. So my original approach to the town and to talk to them about the possibility was well received, and I was encouraged to make an application to the town to build a second residence on the property. And typically you can build a secondary residence without subdividing, but I wanted to subdivide so that we could rent out this property while we're still in good health and stay in our 3-story house. And when we needed to move into a single level home, we'd be able to do that. So, but once I needed to move into a single level home, I didn't want to be a landlord for the 3-story house next door. So we've applied for a severance so that at one point we can actually sell our existing residence and use those proceeds to take care of ourselves in our final years. So this is a concept that I spoke to with a number of people. A number of people showed interest. So yeah, so the reason the infill helps affordability is that building lots right now in Arnprior are over up to $200,000. So when building even a simple single level 2-bedroom 1-bathroom home that is fit for handicapped, wheelchair access, that kind of thing, even at 1,000 square feet, 2-bedroom 1-bath, it can easily be $250,000 to $300,000 without the cost of land. And with the cost of land at $200,000, it just really makes it prohibitive to make things affordable. So every time $1,000 is put into building something, someone who has to finance that with a mortgage is looking at almost $400 a month, plus the property taxes. So by using land that we already own, it will save about $800 a month in what we can rent it out for. So that's the reason we're taking that approach. The design, as I mentioned, would be all on one level, 36-inch wide doors, so it's very accessible for wheelchairs. The bathroom would be 0 threshold showers, as you see in care centers and long-term care homes. There would also be a bathtub. The rest of the house would be a fairly normal looking house, but with slightly wider hallways. And it would have a nice backyard, and we would be providing snow removal and lawn maintenance for whoever's living there for the next 10 to 12 years. So I think the positive feedback that I've received has been for people who are really like the idea of taking care of their own family members or being taken care of by their own family members. So many of us with these large lots, if we can build even a small unit that's there, that would help long-term with the expenses of property taxes and utilities. So that's really beneficial for people that are aging in place in their existing homes. And it's also very beneficial for young couples who are starting out that could possibly get a small additional dwelling unit in their backyard built to help them with expenses and pay off their mortgage over the years as well. So that's a very positive aspect that a number of people have spoken to me about that they are happy about. From a negative point of view, I think it's really hard for people to accept change when they don't know exactly how it's going to go. You know, just, I think a loss of control is a big part of it. And people are concerned, at specific neighbors who understandably had concerns that, well, if you do this in your backyard, what happens if my neighbor does it in his backyard and he doesn't take into account what I am, my privacy, what I'm looking for, what I've developed in my backyard. I don't want that reduced by you know, having a neighbor getting permission to build in his backyard when it's going to really dramatically affect how I can enjoy mine. So in the plan that we've drawn up, we have spoken to our neighbor who would be directly affected and have altered the plan so that it's going to be attractive for her and for us. And we've oriented the new structure into our existing backyard so that the neighbors aren't going to be affected by it. Our existing house will. So for the 12 to 15 years, hopefully, that our health stays great, or hopefully longer, and we have other people living in the house, we're going to be sharing our backyard and enjoying it together. So the other issue that came up from neighbors that I was actually really surprised by is that they're worried. And I think I just moved back here. I'm from Manotick originally. I've been gone for 40 years. My mother lived in Arnprior for 20 years before she passed. I have a nephew here, and my sister and brother-in-law live here. And I have been back and forth to Arnprior many times over the last 30 years. And it's just really exploded in growth the last 3 to 5 years. And I think for a lot of people, compounded with COVID, it's been kind of stressful that things are changing as rapidly as they are. So I'm still experiencing it as a really beautiful, cool place like I did Manotick when I grew up. And when I go through Manotick now, I see that it's pretty much been swallowed by Ottawa. And I could see why people might have the same concerns here, that could happen here, or that it already has happened or is happening. So, some concerns that came up from people about infill is that it's just going to compound the stress that's already put on infrastructure. People are worried about, like, the schools getting overcrowded. Will the town be able to keep up with infrastructure, with water, with sewer, with transportation, with road maintenance, all that kind of thing? So those are understandable concerns, but I was surprised really how strongly some people are concerned about that. And I think that really speaks to just how quickly things have been building, moving, and changing here. So any approach that's taken to infill housing or any other development obviously needs a lot of listening involved in order to help people understand what's going on. So my experience in my original application, I received a lot of support and education from the planning department in the town of Arnprior. And I was very surprised. I've been involved only in small scale developments. I've never been involved in really large scale developments before, but I've been involved in this level of development in different jurisdictions. And I was very happy to experience a level of support and patience to come to an understanding of what's required by the town in order to get approval for the project that I'm interested in doing. So I'm going through a more complicated process where I'm actually trying to sever my property, and I'm also asking for a variance to make it narrower, the severed property narrower than would traditionally be acceptable or allowed. And that has gone through its first process with the Committee of Adjustments, and they were needing some refinement on how we deal with the parking and the way the whole front of the lot looks, to make sure we're not all driveway and having a loss of green space. So the first level of submissions happen, and the second level of submission will be happening, and next meeting is on April 28th. So I'm looking forward to getting the feedback from the committee adjustments there to see if in fact we've been able to address all the concerns, and then would look forward to proceeding. In terms of people looking at the possibility of building an additional unit on their property and or subdividing a property they have because it's quite large, I would recommend they have initial conversations with the planning department in the town of Arnprior and see where it leads them. It's really, I think, a different level of development than so many people are understandably concerned about, because it's a level of development that is personal, it's controllable by the homeowners, it's not about a huge profit making from developers who are not necessarily invested in the town. Most people who would be dealing with infill housing and doing what we're doing would be residents here. They're committed here. They have skin in the game to make sure whatever they develop right next door to themselves is an acceptable and beautiful piece of development. So it'll be interesting to see how this moves forward with the really strong impetus that's being put on this from the provincial government to increase intensification. And it's going to be interesting to see how the rubber meets the road, because I think it's easier for the province to say, this is what we like to see municipalities do. We like to see them loosen up their bylaws and everything, but it's a whole nother ballgame for elected officials in our municipalities to deal with the complex desires, fears, and needs of a broad range of people. It's a lot harder to do that than it is to just issue a mandate from the provincial level. So my hope is that we can approach this, my wife and I, as we go through this, that we can go through this process in a way that's respectful of our neighbors and enhances the beauty of the neighborhood and allows us to take care of our family in a way that's less traditional, or perhaps more traditional from 100 years ago, when we actually took care of family directly instead of having the provincial government take care of our families for us. So we're hoping that this is something that can grow organically and would be helpful for people, whether they're just trying to help themselves with their expenses so they can stay in their house themselves, or in our instance where we'd be building a unit so someone can move in, we can help take care of them an hour or two a day, and then in turn, when we're ready, we move in and sell our house and have what we need to take care of ourselves. So it's an idea that I think can offset some of the affordability issues, because presently in Arnprior area, land is representing 35 to 40% of the expense of creating any kind of development. So if folks already own that piece of land and they're only dealing with the construction costs and the development costs that the city requires, it really helped make things somewhat more affordable.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to my presentation on moving forward with affordable housing options in the communities of Arnprior, McNabb, Braeside. My name is Karen Simpson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Arnprior and District Family Health Team. And prior to my role here, and then prior to that, the Ministry of Health, I was actually the Executive Director of an affordable housing corporation that provided a number of different housing projects and also did some volunteer work in the housing area. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides, and then I'll walk you through the slides. So here we go. So these are my slides moving forward with affordable housing options for a presentation on April 18th, 2022. So welcome. So as mentioned before, I was previously the Executive Director for 15 years of the Almonte Community Development Corporation. It then became known as the Mills Community Support Corporation and now is called CareBridge in Almonte. In my role with the Almonte Community Development Corporation, the Mills Community Support Corporation, I managed and oversaw the development of 8 affordable housing projects, including housing for seniors, family, and mixed housing, as well as housing for persons with a developmental disability, which included both individual housing and group home housing. Funding for these initiatives came from the federal government and the provincial government, and there were multiple different housing initiatives that we submitted proposals for and built housing under those initiatives. In addition, I was chair of 2 nonprofit housing groups in Carleton Place. In that capacity, I was involved in the development and build of a family housing project and a seniors housing project, as well as involved in the formation of the nonprofit corporations that were required to apply and oversee the funding of those initiatives. I was also treasurer and board member with the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association and was recipient of an Outstanding Leadership Award with that group. Affordable housing has always been an interest, in fact, I would say almost a passion of mine, as appropriate and affordable housing really does provide the foundation for people to be healthy and well. It is one of the determinants of health and is critical to ensuring that people are able to move ahead with their lives. So what does it take to create new affordable housing options? Well, there's many things that it takes, but one of the most critical things is that you need a group of really committed and passionate people who are willing to put the time and the energy in to make it successful. Without those people, it just won't happen. To apply for funding from either the provincial or federal government, you will need a corporate body who will complete the proposal, who will be responsible for the project and oversee any funding that's approved. This can be done through the creation of a nonprofit corporation. It could be a municipal not-for-profit corporation or a private not-for-profit corporation. It could also be done through an existing nonprofit corporation who has an interest in affordable housing, is willing to submit a proposal, but is also willing to see that proposal through to its end. To be successful in applying for the funding, it will require data outlining the need for affordable housing based on demographic data, that's the latest census data usually, and evidence proving the need for additional housing, as well as market rental information that's local to that community. The proposal will also require consideration of the mix of housing types, so row housing, apartments, single, duplex homes, etc., the population to be served. Are we talking about families, single individuals, people with disabilities, or a mix of all of those? The number of units, proposed locations if available, or a description of how a search for a viable property will be undertaken. The mix of types of units, so how many rent to income, how many market rentals would you propose having? And there may be something in the proposals that actually require a certain percentage of rent to income versus market rent. And any barriers that you anticipate. So for example, is there going to be neighborhood opposition? Are there any concerns environmentally that you need to look at? And then a plan on how you will address those barriers. The other thing you need to consider is a draft budget and a communication plan. Prior to submitting the proposal, it is important to understand what the funding options are that are available. what information will be required for the proposal, and what level of funding would be there if the proposal is successful. Because some initiatives don't cover all of the costs of a project. Some may cover most of it, but not all. How do we build momentum for the project? Well, one of the first steps is to use the data that's available to prove the need locally for additional affordable housing. There may be sources of data from surveys, census data, municipal analysis that will support that need for additional housing. I know locally here in Arnprior, McNabb, Braeside, there have been a number of surveys done to garner the interest locally in affordable housing and determine some of the needs and what types of housing is required. There's a need to make presentations to key stakeholders to get their support. So that would include your local municipal groups, community groups, health and social service organizations, and others, which I think would include your faith groups as well, because they're also a key partner in many of these types of projects. Expect some opposition and talk about how you can mitigate those concerns. Develop a plan and timeline and bring people on board by inviting them to sit on working groups or making sure they have opportunities to express any concerns, ideas, or supports. Key considerations: ensure your working group is representative of the community and includes representation from key constituencies. So an example would be your municipal representatives, faith groups, health and social service groups, community groups, and it's always really important to consult and consider on your groups those individuals who you're hoping may want to move into that project once it's completed. Obstacles: always be ready to adapt your proposal and initiative to account for changes in direction or funding. So a good example of that is I had a project one time where the actual cost came in 30% higher than the approved funding in the approved budget. We spent a lot of time looking at that project and the project design to see where we could save money. We ended up actually saving most of the money on the outside of the project, on landscaping, on some of the additional detail work that we had had in place. And it was a group home for individuals with a developmental and physical disability. We were successful, and we did it without actually compromising the ability to use the inside of the home to serve those people that we wanted to serve, and it was a very successful project. The consideration of the location and community concerns. And I think with the community concerns, what's so important here is to listen, is to hear what the concerns are, to address them, to look at how you can mitigate them, to include the individuals in the project, on those working groups, on those other groups, because by involving them, you can hopefully help to address their concerns right from the start and ensure your project is truly representative of the community in which it's being built. And the other factor is to celebrate. So always celebrate the wins along the way. Developing affordable housing is very, very satisfying when it's built and you actually see people move into their new homes. It's a long-term project that you will see continue to grow and flourish throughout your lifetime and that of the community. It's there for a long time. So every time you see that in that project, you can remember all of those hurdles and all of that work that went into seeing that built, but then look at what you have as a community now that it's there. And then finally, garden homes, tiny homes, which is the subject of one of the sessions in this series, is one example of an affordable housing type. There are many others. There's apartment housing, there's row housing, there's a mix of all of the above. Garden homes or tiny homes are affordable because they're small, they're condensed, so cost less to construct and operate. And they are one option in a range of options available to the community to consider. So good luck with developing affordable housing. I think it's something that's really important for this community. It's always important for every community. And today, affordable housing is so critical for so many communities to ensure that people have a decent place to live and to build their life on. Thank you for listening, and I'm open to taking questions.
Hello, my name is Regina Rolf, and I've been asked to share some of my experiences with you. I'm a senior citizen, of course, and I think I've had a lot of experience in different living situations. I was going to start out with my present situation, which is what I was asked to talk about. But in case there are any questions, I want to tell you that I've had a variety of experiences living. I've owned a home. I've lived with 3 students in a house for a while. I've lived in garden type apartments, which are lovely buildings. There are only 4 apartments in a building, and they face an open space. I've lived in high rises. I've also now I'm presently living in a nice suite in my son's home with his family, but I have lived in a family home on the top floor that I rented, and they were strangers. So I've had that experience of living with family in a home and also with living as a renter. So I'll just tell you that I've retired to this area to be with my only son, his wife, and 8 children. Now, he didn't have the whole 8 children when I first came. That was about 20 years ago. When I first came here, they owned a house on Osborne Street in Braeside, on top of the hill leading out to the quarry. I was coming from city living and wondered how I would manage in a semi-rural, small-town area. Well, turns out I loved it. And now, with all the growth, I feel like I have every amenity I could ask for. That house on Osborne had enough room and bedrooms for the family, so they felt I could have the entire downstairs. The house was built into a hill, so the downstairs was at ground level, not underground. It consisted of a hallway leading to my son's office, then French doors leading to a large room, which would be my living room, then a full bathroom, a storage area, and a good-sized bedroom, as well as a door to an outside patio. After a few weeks, I moved a desk and my computer into a corner of that large living room, put a screen around it, and turned the rest of the room back to the family. That room was just too big for me, and I did my reading, etc., in a nook in my bedroom. And of course, in the summertime, I had the patio, basically lived out there and in the garden. Now, what my area did not have was a kitchen. The family had put a full-size range and a full-size fridge in the furnace room for me. Believe it or not, that actually worked okay. Didn't have a sink, though. I don't do a tremendous amount of cooking, but it served me fine. I usually ate in front of the TV anyway, and several times weekly upstairs with the family. We knew changes would have to be made at some point. Change came in the shape of moving into an even larger house in the older part of Dockard Estates in Braeside. Again, the house was built into a hill, and most of the downstairs was at ground level. Part of it was already made into an in-law suite, which is where I live. It's a fairly large room divided into kitchen and living room, a very large bedroom, a bathroom, a walk-in closet, and a separate entrance to a patio. Entrance to my place can also be from the front door, down a small flight of steps, or coming in from the garage, which is on the same level as my suite. I am very happy there. I have all the privacy I could wish for, mostly because it is a quiet house. The kids are now of an age where they're not running around, screaming, etc. But also the house is so large that noises do not travel very much. I have the luxury of having someone else take care of the snow on the walkways. I have taken on redoing part of the antiquated bathroom. I pay some rent and a portion of the phone and internet monthly charges, and try to avoid being an expense to the family. I have contributed to some large upkeep projects. When we moved here, we inherited a large perennial garden, which is my joy to work in during the summer, and I hope contributes to the look of the property. I am up and down into the families area quite a lot, but one thing I've done from the beginning is not to go up first thing in the morning or in the late evenings. I feel these are vulnerable times for people with the whole waking up thing and also being tired at the end of the day and winding down. If I were not family, but living there as a senior citizen, it might be the case where the homeowners could arrange for babysitting duties or even house sitting when they were away. I can see a lot, or pet sitting. I can see a lot of advantages to opening a large house to a senior or a student that could be beneficial for both. For situations where a family takes in a renter, either in just a room or a full apartment, expectations would need to be spelled out from the beginning and perhaps put into writing, I think. This is what I believe. Things like, can the yard be used? Who fixes any appliances that break down? How is the heat and air conditioning regulated? Will the walks be shoveled and safe in the winter snow? If it was a student that you had living in your home, would they be willing to do snow removal, help in the garden, etc., for a small reduction of rent? I neglected to say, and someone felt that it was important, that I chose this when I was at early retirement, 64. I chose this way of life. And sometimes that doesn't happen, that people are basically forced into leaving a large home and moving into somewhere smaller, or forced into having help in their home because they need the help. I will say that I lived alone for many, many, many years, but the last 5 years, I really didn't want to be alone. I could see the benefit of having others nearby, the benefit for safety, but also I was tired of just thinking about myself. Everything revolved around what I wanted, what I needed, what I was going to do the next minute. And then there was a safety issue. I know when I was living in the garden apartment, I made very sure that I knew where the connecting wall was in case I had to bang on the wall in an emergency. And I tried to get to know my neighbors a little bit in case of emergency so I could call on them. But I really thought it was time not to be living alone anymore. And I'm very glad I made that decision early and have built up a network of places that I know are safe and people that I know are safe and where I could go, have a good doctor. All of those things were important to get in place. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope there's time for questions. Thank you again.